This video is a beginner's guide to Apple Motion in 2026. By the end of this video, you'll have created this dynamic subscribe animation all on your own. Within this video, I'm going to show you how to add in your own logo image. I'm going to show you how to animate shapes and titles. And lastly, I'm going to show you how to create this as a reusable template for Final Cut Pro so you can use it in your videos as much as you want. There are a lot of guides out there for Apple Motion that aim to condense everything down into just a couple minutes. But for this video, I just want to slow things down a little bit, make Motion a little bit less intimidating, and really try and get the core concepts of Motion across so that you can start to use it in your everyday editing life. For those of you who don't even know what Apple Motion is a companion app to Final Cut Pro. Its primary focus is for creating motion graphics, which is why its name is called Motion. But a really key feature of Apple Motion is the fact that it shares the same engine as Final Cut Pro, and because of that, you are able to create reusable titles and templates for Final Cut Pro. And that's honestly the core foundation of a lot of your favorite plugins that you've purchased online. All of the plugins I've ever created have been made 100% inside of Apple Motion without a single line of code. So if that sounds like something you want to learn a bit more about, stick around because we are going to create your first ever Apple Motion project. The first thing we're going to do is, of course, open up Motion. If you have subscribed to Apple Creator Studio, your icon is going to look like this. If, however, you've purchased Apple Motion, your icon will look just like this. I'll go ahead and open up the Apple Creator Studio version. If you are not greeted with the project browser, you can always go up to File and then select New from Project Browser. From the project browser, you have several different options. One is just a basic Motion project. This means that it doesn't really have any ties over to Final Cut Pro. However, all of the other Motion project styles make it so you can create plugins and templates for Final Cut Pro. So there's the Final Cut effect, the generator, the transition, and of course the Final Cut title. For this particular video, we're going to create a title. With that selected, we'll come up here to the top right, and you're always going to be able to choose the basic options you want for your project. I almost always recommend that these particular project settings are set to what you like to edit with in Final Cut Pro. So for example, if you typically like to edit on a 24p timeline in 4K, that's the exact same setting I would set up here. For this video, I'm going to go ahead and do a 4K timeline at a frame rate of 2997 with a duration of about 5 seconds. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and push open. Now, when you first see this screen, it can look very intimidating because it's completely different from Final Cut Pro. But if you just take a moment, it's actually quite simple. This window here is your viewer. This is where you're going to see all of the animations that you build out. Below it is this timeline. So it's just like the Final Cut timeline. There's a timeline at the bottom of the screen. However, this timeline is not magnetic like it is over in Final Cut Pro. So that can take a little bit of getting used to, but it's really not too bad. This panel here is for all of your layers. So when you add titles, when you add graphics, anything like that will be found inside of this panel. Over here on the far left, there is a library which comes with loads of generators and effects and replicators, all sorts of stuff to play around with. But on top of that is the inspector. The inspector is extremely important when you want to adjust different parameters and effects. With that out of the way, let's build this thing. When you select a Final Cut title template, it's always going to bring in a type text here layer and a title background. These are just here to get you up and running quickly. However, for this particular project, they're not important. So we can delete the type text here and title background. The first thing we need is a basic shape. To do that, we can come down here to the rectangle tool. You also have some additional tools by clicking on this down arrow. There's a circle and a line. Let's go ahead and select the rectangle tool, and we'll just create a basic rectangle shape. Now that we've created that shape, you'll notice here in our inspector that our transform is being revealed, and we can see that it's not perfectly centered. It's got an X of -36 and a Y value of 129. You could go ahead and just type in 0 in both of these fields if you want to, but if you want to center stuff really easily, you can just right-click on the position and then select Reset Parameter. With that rectangle selected, you'll notice a whole bunch of tabs here at the top above the transform panel. So we've got behaviors, filters, and shape. Your shape panel is where you're going to change stuff like the color and the roundness. For example, you can see we have our fill. I can disable the fill and enable just the outline if I want to. Or we can also come up here to the geometry tab, and that's where we can change the roundness. So I'm going to drag this roundness all the way up to 50, and you'll see that that's giving us these nice rounded edges. There's also this checkbox for preserve scale. If we go ahead and leave this checked, I'll go to my properties under the scale parameter, and let's scale this down on the y-axis. You'll notice that the corners are actually shifting in their scale, which is kind of annoying, honestly, with some of your animations. So what I recommend is instead disabling preserve scale, and you'll notice now that as I drag this X value down, it's still retaining the corners that we created previously. This is how I like my animations to look, but it's totally up to you. So in our shape panel, we're going to disable preserve scale, and then we'll come down here to the size panel. You'll notice a lot of different parameters oftentimes have these arrows next to them. That means you can expand them out and apply even more settings. So for example, let's expand the size, and now we have access to the width and the height. So I'm going to set the width to a value of 1200, and we'll set the height to a value of 300. Setting those exact values is going to be really helpful when we want to adjust stuff like the anchor point. The anchor point can be changed on any object by coming down here to our arrow tool, and there's this down arrow, and you'll see that we have a whole bunch of tools we can play around with. Transform, anchor point like I talked about, drop shadow, distort, edit rectangle, and adjust item. So if you're looking for a specific tool, maybe check in this menu really quickly. For this, we just want the anchor point, and you'll notice that by selecting that, it's changed what the anchor point in the center of my project looked like. So now I can actually click and drag, and this is not moving my object around. It's just moving the anchor point. And what the anchor point does is, let's say I put this in the top left corner of our object. We go to our properties. As I scale this down, everything is going to scale towards that anchor point. So we could even set this way up here in the top and scale it down, and now everything's moving up towards the top. And in fact, for this particular project, what I would like to do is put this anchor point on the far left side of our rectangle, line it up just like that. And so now, if we scale down on the y-axis, we can shrink everything down into that anchor point. Now, you might remember that I set specific values for this rectangle earlier in the shape panel here, and we set it to a value of 1200. If we take a look at that anchor point down here at the bottom, you'll notice that the x-axis is negative 617. So it's not an exact number. And so if you take a really close look, you'll notice that our anchor point is actually making the rectangle slide off a little bit. So all we need to do is just type in a value of negative 600, and we will know for a fact that it will be locked to that edge because 600 is half of 1200. And of course, our anchor point started right here in the middle. So we're just moving it halfway to that negative 600 mark. Let's also change this y value so it's not moved up vertically at all. And we'll just set that to a value of 0. And now we should be good to go. So if we scale this down, there should be no sliding around, which is exactly what we want. Now that we've done that, we can start to animate this rectangle. And you could go crazy with keyframes, which are very similar to keyframes in Final Cut Pro, although they have a lot more features to them. But something I want to cover in this video that I think is extremely important to be aware of is parameter behaviors. Parameter behaviors are essential inside of Apple Motion because they can make animation go from an absolute chore to being one of the easiest parts of the process. I personally like to think of parameter behaviors as essentially little customizable presets that you can apply to almost anything. So in this example, we have our rectangle, and I want to animate it overshooting and then coming back to its original scale. You'll notice that on my scale parameter, I've expanded that out, and we have our X value. So if we come to the right, you'll notice this down arrow, and by clicking that, we can go down to Add Parameter Behavior and select the parameter of overshoot. At first, nothing is going to happen because we need to change the values on this to start to get something to work. So you'll see that the start value is 0%, so we have a 0% change. You might be wondering how much to change this. Well, we're going to want to change it to negative 100% to start it from complete 0. How do we know that that's going to get us a value of 0? Well, if we take a look at our rectangle, you'll see the X value here. And you'll notice the Y and Z parameters here are set to a value of 100%. And if I move forward, you'll see that that's also 100% on X. So we're trying to subtract that 100% value. So for example, if this started at a value of 50%, then inside of our overshoot parameter, we would want to set this to a value of negative 50%. However, that's only going to shrink our rectangle halfway in this instance. So make sure you set that to a value of negative 100%, and you should be good to go. So here is what's really cool about parameter behaviors. For example, this overshoot one. If we come down here to the bottom right, there's these 3 diamonds, and that is your keyframe editor. And this gives you a visual graph of all of the animations taking place. So you can kind of start to see the animation taking place here. It's very slow though, because it's stretched out over the entire duration of our project. So I'm going to come down here to our overshoot parameter. And if we click and drag on the right side, we can actually trim this down just like a clip inside of Final Cut Pro. And I'm going to just trim this all the way down to maybe about 15 frames or so. So it starts with this strong arc up, and then it comes down, goes up, goes down. So if we take a look at our rectangle here and push play, we can see that we're getting this nice dynamic animation, almost like it's jello or elastic happening here with our rectangle. And I didn't have to do any of that manually. It was all done with the parameter behavior. But what's really cool is we can come over here to the left side and start to adjust the different values. So for example, the ramp duration. Take a look here at the ramp that's happening here at the beginning. And if I shorten this down, there's actually more momentum here at the beginning. It's going higher up over the top of the line, and it's shortening down how long the animation takes place. So right now, the initial animation is happening over only 12% of the duration of our overshoot. So let's go ahead and also adjust the cycles. Right now, it's bouncing 3 times. If we set this to a value of 1, you'll see that we get one big arc. So let's go ahead and push play and see how that looks. Maybe it is a little bit fast, and that's another really cool thing with parameter behaviors is we can adjust the timing really simply. So let's go ahead and come out to 1 second, and I'll extend this out. And now the animation will be a lot slower, but it's going to retain all of those changes we've applied. So that is looking super cool with very minimal effort, but maybe it's shooting out just a little bit too far. So let's adjust our ramp duration down a little bit and see how that looks. Yeah, I love that. That's super fun. Now that we have our rectangle in place, I'd love to add my channel icon. To do that, I'm just going to come up here to the import button and click on import and select import media. I have a whole bunch of different photos here. I'm just going to select my icon.jpg, and there it is. Now, this is a large photo on my project, so we just need to shrink this down. But before we do that, I would love to set this image as a drop zone, which means we can change it over in Final Cut Pro really easily. With the icon selected in the Image tab, you'll notice it says Drop Zone Type Off. Let's just set that to a drop zone. And now, over in Final Cut Pro, we'll be able to swap out this image with absolutely anything that we want. Let's go ahead and go to our properties on this image, and we can shrink it down so that people don't have to look at my ugly face quite so much. Let's also switch over to our transform tool by clicking this down arrow, selecting transform, and let's move it roughly into position. Maybe I'll scale it up just a little bit. I find that around 10% works pretty well for this. So obviously we don't want this image to have these squared off corners, and that is where masks come into play, and they are huge in motion. This will just be a really quick, simple overview. But what we can do is come down to our masking tools, and you'll see we have our rectangle mask, but I can also select the circle mask. And with my drop zone selected, I can find the top left corner there, hold shift and click and drag, and we'll just create a basic circle around my image. And just like that, we've removed the corners. In motion, you're able to move your masks around independently as long as you're in this edit ellipse mode, and that'll make it really easy to move your mask as needed. And you can also disable your mask by clicking on this icon. So if you need to see a full-size version of your image, you can do that really quickly here. Okay, so we have our mask in place. I would love for this image to kind of pop off the screen a little bit, and that's where drop shadows come into play. To do so, let's go ahead and collapse the drop zone down. Then we're going to go over to the left side under our properties, and you'll see that we have this drop shadow option here. So I can check that box, and then you'll notice that we can expand that by pressing show, and now we can increase the distance and the blur values. And so we're getting a nice little drop shadow here underneath our image. We could also bring up the opacity if we want. It's really up to you. So we now have our image in place, but obviously it's not animating with our rectangle as nicely as our rectangle looks. So let's add some nice animation to this. To make this really simple, I'm actually going to place this drop zone into a separate group. I'm going to right click and select group. The reason I'm doing this is because our drop zone, if we go over here to the properties, is set to a value of 10%. And I want to add some animations with the overshoot parameter. Subtracting 10% is not a big problem, but if we ever want to change the scale on this particular image, then things can get a little bit crazy and we need to offset those adjustments inside of the overshoot parameter. However, if we go to the group, you'll notice that the group has a value of 100%. So image is 10% inside of the group, and the group itself is 100% value. So I can use the overshoot parameter at a negative 100% value, and I can still change the drop zone scale to whatever I want, and it will still always be zeroed out. It might seem like a lot of information right up front, but knowing this stuff is going to be so helpful down the road. I want to go ahead and animate this group shrinking down, so making sure this group is selected, let's go to the scale parameter. And we're just going to add it to all of the scale at the same time. So let's go to the right here under the scale, click this down arrow, add a parameter behavior, and we're going to select overshoot. Let's set this start value to negative 100% to negate that. And let's go ahead and trim down the duration of our overshoot. And I want this to be maybe half a second, which would be 15 frames on a 30 frame timeline. And let's see how that's looking. That's looking pretty nice, but it is a little bit too bouncy for my liking. So let's adjust the cycles on this down to 1 and see how that looks. That's looking pretty nice. And maybe I want it to start a frame or two after the rectangle has started, because right now you'll see that it's kind of starting over the void here. So let's just click on the group heading there and drag it to the right, and that will move everything over. So it's a little bit later in time, maybe even one more frame. So now we have this dynamic animation of my face and the rectangle. Let's go ahead and add in some titles. To do so, let's find our title tool here at the bottom, and we'll just click absolutely anywhere, and we can start to type in what we want. So I'll just type in Dylan Bates, the Final Cut Bro. With your titles here in Motion, you can change the font, size, alignment, all sorts of options up here at the top. So let's change this over to Roboto, which is the font that I believe Google uses for YouTube, and we could make it maybe the bold version. Right now, it is a white color, and we want to make it visible over the rectangle here. So if I move this down right now, it's invisible. Let's go over to our Appearance tab, and that is where you're going to change the color on your different titles. So we can go to our Appearance, and I'll just set this to a black value. Now, under our format settings, we can adjust the scale, and we can shrink this down a fair amount. Just get it looking pretty good, and I'm liking that. Let's add in a subtext. So to do that, we can select that same title if we want to retain basically all of the same settings, and we can right click on it and select duplicate, or you can also get that with Command D on your keyboard. I'm going to move this down in the layer stack underneath. It's not that important. It just helps me mentally. And we can go ahead and just type in how many subscribers I have, right? So let's do 85,000 subscribers. We'll just do 85K. And let's move this down vertically and get it a little bit lower, somewhere in there. And let's change this more to a thin. Maybe that's too thin. Let's try the light. That's looking pretty good. Perfect. So we have my title and we have how many subscribers are there. Now, you might have noticed something. As I push play, our title is actually popping out with the shape of our drop zone. So that is because we applied this overshoot parameter directly onto the group which contains the drop zone. So that entire group is being animated all at once, and those titles are found inside of that group. We actually need to move these titles out of the group if we don't want that. So to do so, I'm going to hold Shift and select both of these layers, then just click and drag it out of that group, and we should be good to go. So now just the image is animating and the titles are being left alone. Let's also rename this to be our photo. And I'll go ahead and collapse that for now so we don't need to take a look at it. So we have added in these titles, but there's no dynamism to them. They're just kind of sitting there. And in fact, if I were to reveal the background, I'll do this with Shift T. We can see the transparent version now. That title is just sitting there. And so if we were to put this on our timeline in Final Cut Pro, our name would show up, and we obviously don't want that. I'm going to push Shift C to get back to the original view we had. And let's select our top layer of text, go to our behaviors, and you'll see down here at the bottom, we have a whole bunch of categories for text. So if we take a look here at text basic, there's all of these different parameters. And one that I really like to play around with is arrange in. And let's just see how that looks. You can see how all of the text is coming in really smoothly. I just love this particular text behavior. So that one looks great. Let's go ahead and do another one for 85,000 subscribers. We'll select that. We'll go up to our behaviors. We'll go to text basic. And this time, let's try substitute in. And you can see how it's kind of shifting the text. I'll hide those controls. So it's shifting the text and slowly counting in the number of subscribers. Just kind of a fun animation. Maybe we want these to happen just a little bit later, so we could select both of the title layers and drag them over to the right a little bit. And that is looking great. So we now have a dynamic rectangle, an image, and some animated text. Let's add in our subscribe button. To do so, I'm going to right click and create an entirely new group. And we're going to call this the subscribe button group. With that subscribe button group selected, let's come down to our rectangle tool and we'll just create a basic rectangle. Now the rectangle is white, so we can't see it against the white background. So let's come over here to the left and change the color to a vibrant subscriber red. It's squared off, so you might remember we can go to the geometry tab and drag up the roundness. And it's going to be up to you how round you want this. You definitely want it to kind of match as closely as possible to the edges. I'm not quite happy with the placement, so I'm going to get my arrow tool and I'm just going to click and drag this till it's centered. That's looking pretty good there. Next, we need to add some text to the subscribe button, of course. So let's get our text tool and we'll just click in the middle there and type in subscribe. I'm going to change the font on that. So we'll go over here to the left side and let's set it to bold. And that's looking good to me. And we can drag it to the center of our button. And I'm also going to change the alignment on this. So we'll go over here to the left side and select the centered alignment. And I should have done that first. So it looks like I got to reset that. There we go. And now we have a subscribe button. Again, I'm not super happy with that placement. So I'm going to push Command while I drag it around to kind of turn off that snapping. There we go. So of course we want this subscribe button to appear in a nice way. So let's go ahead and start to take a look at keyframes. Selecting the subscribe button group, we'll go over to our properties. And you'll see over here on the right side, we have these gray diamonds. These are just like the gray diamonds over in Final Cut Pro. Let's find the point where we want the animation to begin. So somewhere around here, I feel like is pretty good. For me, that's 21 frames in. Let's go to our rotation panel and you'll see that I can rotate on the X, the Y, and the Z parameters. So you can get really crazy with this and you'll even see that the anchor point's over here on the left side. So that's why it's rotating around that point. So let's change our anchor point and drag that to the center of our subscribe button. And let's rotate this object until it's completely invisible from the frame. Now I'm going to come over here and add in a keyframe and then move forward in time. And let's change this value to 0. And because I've changed this value after I've added a keyframe, it now automatically adds keyframes as I continue forward. So if I were to move my playhead forward again, and change this value, it would automatically add in another keyframe. So just keep that in mind. And if we push play, we should see it rotating in place just like so. Obviously, we don't want it to be floating in here and I don't have it perfectly zeroed out. So let's just find when it starts and you can see that keyframe here in your timeline. And we'll select our subscribe button group and push I to trim it down. I is setting the in point. So I always use I and O to set in points, out points, and that allows you to trim off the beginning or the end. Very cool. We have a nice basic rotation in of our subscribe text. One last thing I want to add to the subscribe button is a bit of a drop shadow. So let's select that subscribe button. We'll go to our properties panel again. And just like we did with the logo image, we'll check the add a drop shadow and we can drag out the distance and the blur. And that looks super nice. Great. So we have this dynamic animation that we've built from scratch. But now it's time to animate a mouse clicking on the subscribe button. To do that, let's go up to our library in the top left, and then we'll come down to shapes, and then we'll go to arrow cursor, and we'll just drag this arrow cursor into our layers panel. So we can animate this arrow cursor any way we want to. Now, we could use keyframes, and that's great, but something I love using is the motion path parameter behavior. I'm going to zoom out here because things get a little bit crazy when you first add this parameter. We'll select our arrow cursor. We'll go up to behaviors, basic motion, and you can select motion path. Now with this motion path, you'll notice that we have this red line. This is the path that the mouse is going to take. So if we drag our timeline back to the beginning, you'll see it starting on point A here. So let's take point A and drag that off the screen. And then this point will be point B. So let's just drag this to the end position we want. And I'll go ahead and move forward in time. That's where we can see our subscribe button. We'll select our motion path, drag that to that final point. So over the entire duration of our project, we'll have this slow moving motion path. Obviously, I want this animation to be a lot faster. So let's figure out where we want the animation to start, somewhere around frame 20. We'll select our arrow cursor, entire group actually, and I'm just rename this to be the cursor group. So with that entire group selected, we're going to push I. That's going to again set the in point. And then we'll move forward to the end of where we want the animation. And we want it to be pretty quick. People work very quickly with the mouse. So then we'll select our motion path. And again, this motion path is almost the entire duration of the project. So it's going to be very slow moving up. So we'll find our motion path and we'll find when we want the animation to end, somewhere around here. And we'll push O. And so now we have that animation playing out of the mouse going up to the end of the subscribe button, which is really handy. And you'll notice that it locks into place at the end. This is so handy. But there's a lot more we can do with this motion path. Right now, it's just a straight line, which isn't too bad, but we could curve it. So let's push and hold command before we click on the motion path point. And you'll see that as I click and drag, that creates a Bezier handle. So now we have a curved path for our mouse cursor. But I really don't like the animation style. It's very linear. We want this to have a nice slow easing to it. So to change that, let's go over to the motion path. We'll make sure that's selected. We're going to go up to the inspector and we're going to change the speed. So right now it's set to constant. We are going to change this over to something like decelerate. So it's going to start off super fast, full speed, and then it'll slow down to its end position. You can even see that play out here in the motion graph. So now we can see that our mouse slides up on the screen and animates in that motion path with the curved line, which looks super nice. From there, we need to animate it clicking. Let's do that by selecting our entire subscribe button group that we created earlier, and I'll even collapse it. And with that selected, let's find the scale parameter. So the mouse lands and we'll go forward a frame or so, and we can find our scale. We'll click to add a keyframe, and then I'm going to use the arrow keys to move forward 2 frames. So 1, 2 by pushing forward on the arrows, and let's set this to a value of 110. You'll notice motion automatically created a new keyframe. We'll move forward 2 more frames. So we'll click on the timeline, 1, 2, and set this back to a value of 100. So we now have this little bump up animation, which is going to look really nice. Let's see how that plays out. Click, and it just pops into place, which is really nice. You could even add in some easing to this animation to smooth it out by clicking and dragging over all of the keyframes in your keyframe editor. Again, this is enabled using these 3 diamonds. We'll right click on it and select ease both. So that has severely smoothed out that animation in a really nice way. Let's go ahead and animate the mouse flying off the screen. And this is so easy with motion paths. We've created this motion path already. We've got a point A to point B. Let's just duplicate that motion path with Command D. And now let's move this secondary motion path copy over here to the right. And what's great is because point A is wherever your object is starting, it's basically already done the animation for us. So it flies into frame, and then point A gets reset to where our mouse is currently, and then flies off the screen again. Now, the animation's a little bit too jarring at the beginning. It doesn't have a smooth takeoff. So we're going to select that motion path copy. Then we'll go over to the left side under the speed, and let's change it to accelerate. So it decelerates to its end position, and then flies off the screen. And once it is off the screen, we could have it actually just completely delete itself. So let's select our cursor group, and we're going to push O to trim it down. So now it's completely gone. So we have our mouse cursor animation, but we want to change it so the subscribe button switches over to say subscribed and make it a completely different color. First, let's start with the color. we'll expand our subscribe button. We'll go to our rectangle, and let's find when the click animation happens, which is right here. We'll go to the shape settings, and we'll make sure we're in the style parameters. In here, we can change the color, and just like we did with the scale, we can add in a keyframe. So let's go to the right and add a keyframe to the color. We'll move forward to the end of the animation, and we'll click on our color panel. From there, I'm going to set this to a gray color, so I'll just select my little white option there. You can get your mouse cursor in the center and drag that down. And so now, over the duration of the animation, it should fade to gray. But we also want the text to change. Unfortunately, you can't keyframe text in the same way you can with a lot of other stuff, but we can very easily split this text layer. So I'm going to select our subscribe text. And what we can do is halfway through the animation, we want it to switch to say subscribed. And we'll come up to edit with the subscribe text selected. We'll go to edit, and then we're going to select split. What this has done is it's set an out point for its initial layer, and then it's created an endpoint for a duplicate layer right at that same point. So we essentially have just two versions of the same title, but they're starting at different times. Now we can take that split of a title, which happens here at the middle, and we'll just add in a D. So now it says subscribed. So let's play our animation out. Everything pops in. It clicks, it says subscribed, and then flies away. And that is looking really dynamic, but there's one last thing we need to do with this, and that is to get the entire animation to disappear. And we're going to do that with some interesting effects. To do so, let's collapse all of our groups. And I'm going to select the first group, hold Shift, and then select the last group so we get all of them at the same time. Right-click and create an entirely new group. We're going to use this group almost as an adjustment layer because everything is contained within inside of this group. So any effects we apply to this master group will apply to all of the layers. Now that we have this group created, let's go up to filters, and we're going to find a filter that works for us. For this, I'm going to go to distortion and select black hole. You'll already start to see stuff taking place, and if I drag up the amount, everything kind of absorbs into itself. So let's set that to an amount of 0 and find where we want everything to absorb in on itself. Because somebody subscribed, I want it to absorb in on the subscribe button here. Let's wait until the mouse flies off the screen. And now at this point, which for me is 2 seconds and 23 frames, we'll just go over to our mount, click to add a keyframe, and move forward a few frames and drag that up. So let's just see how that animation plays out. It absorbs in itself, but it is way too quick. I want to smooth that out. And so down here inside of my keyframe editor, I can select both of the keyframes. Let's right click. We'll go to interpolation. And this is where keyframes can get so amazing. We'll just do a very light version of this. We'll select Bezier. So you'll see that that gives me these Bezier handles to work with. So let's select the first keyframe, and I'm going to hold Shift and drag it over to the right. And that is going to lock it to this axis. So we can kind of smooth out this animation and give it a slower start. And you'll see how that really smoothed out the animation in a nice way. Maybe we want the animation to be a little bit longer, so let's select the second keyframe. And I'm going to hold Shift and click and drag it to the right so it stays on that same axis. And let's play that out. There we go. A little bit slower, but really dynamic looking. So let's go ahead and see how this entire animation plays out, and then I'll show you how to send this over to Final Cut Pro. Pushing play, everything pops in, it says subscribed, and then it absorbs in on itself. It's time to send this over to Final Cut Pro. And there's a key thing you need to know about publishing stuff over to Final Cut Pro, and that is that almost any parameter that you have worked with can be published over. For example, let's say that I want to make it so the background color can be a different color. Well, to do that, we'll just go to the group that contains the rectangle. We'll go to the style, and we'll come to the right of the fill color. And in this menu, you'll notice this option at the bottom to publish. So you can do this with almost any parameter inside of Motion. There are a few select ones that you can't. I don't have time to get into those. But most parameters you see can be published. So again, let's say we want to adjust the fill opacity on this. Click that down arrow and publish. So those will now be accessible over in Final Cut Pro. But the last thing you need to do to get this to Final Cut Pro is to save it, which automatically publishes it. So we'll just go up to File, then we'll go down to Save. And If it's the first time you are saving this template, it should bring up this dialog window. This window lets you set up what the template will be named over in Final Cut Pro when you go to access it. So let's just call it the subscribe button animation. Next, we can change the category, and I recommend creating a category specific to you. You'll see I have a lot. You can create a new category down here at the bottom. For this, I'm going to actually throw this into my Patreon because this will be available as a Patreon download. You can also create a theme, which is a subsection of categories, and it just allows for additional organization. Maybe for this, let's go ahead and throw this into the titles. After that, we can push publish. Once that's been published, we can jump over into Final Cut Pro almost instantaneously and have access to this. So here I am in a project in Final Cut Pro, and I can go up to my titles. Then we can go to my Patreon, and you'll see all of the different themes here. So there's effects, guides, infographic, and if we get to my titles category here, we should see the subscribe button animation. I'll drag that in, and I'll go ahead and push play, and we can see that animation playing out here in Final Cut Pro. But what's also really cool about this is now we've published the fill color, so I can change this over to a completely different option. And you can also change what the text says. So right now it says Dylan Bates, Final Cut Pro. We could change this to say literally any channel name that you would like, and all of the animations will be received. So we could just type in Mr. Beast, and let's go ahead and play this again. And now it says Mr. Beast with that dynamic animation. Plus, you'll remember we added in that drop zone. So if we wanted a completely different image, all I would need to do is bring in that image. Let's do the Final Cut Pro Studio one, and I'll hide that. And we'll use the drop zone, and there it is with all of the dynamic animations applied to it. It might seem like an enormous amount of work to get to this point, but to be very clear, I'm working very slowly and methodically through this entire process. Once you start using motion more and more, a lot of this stuff comes naturally to you, and you can build animations like this in just a matter of minutes. If this video was helpful to you in any way, maybe consider pressing the like button and consider subscribing to help me reach 100,000 subscribers before the end of the year. Also, I'm going to have my Apple Motion Masterclass linked down below for any of those of you that are interested in taking this to the next level. Thanks so much for watching, and I cannot wait to see you in the next one.